Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today's discussion is going to be about basic NixOS configuration and getting started with Flakes. So this is for new to NixOS users, but not necessarily for new to Linux users. You should be familiar with the command line, the core utils. Later on, a basic knowledge of Git is also necessary. And for some of the advanced stuff in NixOS, some knowledge of how programs are compiled is going to be really helpful. Now, I recommend that if you're starting with NixOS and you want to learn it, you start it inside of a VM. And the reason is because your NixOS setup, all of the stuff that you do is contained entirely within your configuration. So it's very easy to just start inside of a VM, get your configuration working the way you want it, and then just jump to bare metal when your system is in the state that you like. So to start off, go ahead and grab the NixOS ISO from nixos.org and set up your VM. Just a few recommendations as you set up your VM. Your VM should have enough memory and enough CPU cores to be able to compile things, because later on there will be some cases where we have to compile things from source. And even more importantly, you need to make sure that the VM has enough hard drive space. If the VM has less than 100 gigs of hard drive space, depending on how many packages you have installed, it might actually be impossible to update it. So 100 gigabytes storage minimum, and I'd recommend more if you can afford it. So I have a tutorial VM already set up, so we're going to go into that and get started. Okay, here we are. So once you have NixOS installed and you've selected whatever default desktop environment you want to have on your system, or maybe you just did no desktop environment and you're staring at a TTY now, we're going to take a look at the configuration files that NixOS is so well known for. So to start off, grab a terminal and navigate to /etc/NixOS. If you look inside of this directory, you're going to see two files, configuration.nix and hardwareconfiguration.nix. Hardwareconfiguration.nix is a file automatically generated by NixOS upon install, and it's tailored to your actual hardware. So this is typically not something you want to be messing with all that much. It's typically something you just auto-generate on install. You can also generate it later, but it's there to set up configuration for certain details of your system that if you mess these up, it may become unbootable. So we don't really mess around with this one. We mainly mess around with the configuration.nix file. You can open this up with Nano, because Nano is the only editor installed by default. And as you open up here, there's quite a bit of stuff going on here. Don't be too afraid of the syntax. Just sort of look through it, and you'll notice there's a few configuration options that you can start messing with, like, for example, the host name. Maybe you want to change the host name to something different, or maybe the time zone or the locale, though those are things that should have been set up in the graphical installer. Even more important than some of these configuration options, however, is the packages installed on the system. And there are two sets of these. There are a set of packages for your user, and there are a set of packages for the system. For now, you can place whatever packages you would like to install in either of these locations. And all you need to do in order to add an application into your configuration is go to this block and add the names of the packages. For example, vim, wget, git. These are really important things. You'll want to make sure you have them, along with any other programs that you like to have around. Most of the package names make total sense, but there are a few package names that don't make a lot of sense. And so there's a resource that I like to use called mynixos.com, and it looks kind of like this. It's a nice search tool that you can use to search up the names of various packages along with the names of various options. And an example of some weirdly named packages are many of the GNOME packages. Like, for example, Geary. Geary is not just Geary. The actual package name is gnome.geary. As you're searching these, packages will be under nix packages/package, and other things like options are going to be nix packages/option. Back to the VM though, once you have a few packages in the system packages block or the user packages block, you can save the file, and now we will synchronize the system state with the state of the configuration file, because these apps are not automatically installed by default. In order to synchronize the system state with the state of the configuration file, we're going to use the command sudo NixOS rebuild switch. What this is going to do is look at your configuration files, figure out what needs to be changed, what needs to be installed, and then switch into that configuration. As you do this, you will notice that there are a bunch of references in the output to something called the Nix store. And long story short, this is where all of the programs that you install will live. They don't live in /user/bin or any of the common locations. They live in here. But more details on that later. Now, before we get any further on all of this, we are going to be migrating the method of configuring the system from what is known as channels to flakes. Channels are the default way of managing the versions of packages on your system, but most people in the Nix community, at least the hardcore Nix users, have been gravitating towards flakes for quite a while now. And they have a few advantages to them that makes things a lot easier as you get farther ahead and you get into some of the more advanced stuff in NixOS. To give you just a quick overview of channels versus flakes, the channels and flakes both manage the versions of the packages, but the difference is that the flakes keep a file called the flake.lock file, which stores all the information about exactly which version every single package on your system is. And you can imagine if you track the flake.lock file using Git, you have a literal time machine for your entire system. You can go back as far as you want, as far as you need to, on a moment's notice, just by reverting your Git repo that you store your configuration files in. So flakes are really cool. So we're going to get those set up as soon as possible. The first thing you have to do in order to set up flakes is we have to go into the configuration file and enable the ability to use flakes. So if we open up the configuration.nix, you can put this option wherever you like. I'm just going to put it at the bottom here. The option is called nix.settings.experimental-features, and we want to enable two experimental features, nix command and flakes. Once you do this, you can save the configuration file and rebuild again. And there we go. Now we will have access to the flake commands, which are normally disabled by default. Now onto the actual creation of the flakes. You can navigate back to your home directory, and I like to have a .files directory. So you can create that directory, .files. You can name this whatever you want, but this is what I use. I, of course, already have it created. And then you navigate to this directory. The first thing we're going to do before we even touch the flake is we are going to copy the configuration.nix and hardware configuration.nix from that etc/NixOS directory into the .files directory. So you have access to both of them. There we go. Then we're going to start writing another Nix file called the flake.nix. So with your favorite text editor, create flake.nix. And the basic structure of a flake file starts with some squiggly brackets. And then inside of these squiggly brackets, we're going to put three main components. The first component is the description. And this is just a string describing what your flake is. So I'm just going to call it my first flake. Then following the end of any line, we put a semicolon. The next section is the inputs block. And the final section is the outputs block. What this is essentially going to do is have a list of every single input to the system. It'll point to it. We'll essentially be pointing to a bunch of Git repositories. And then the outputs block will tell what to do with those inputs. And in this case, the output block is going to be specifying the actual NixOS system that we want to build. Before we get too far into this, I'm going to just save this and exit out of this. And now on my host system, I passed through the .files directory from that VM into here. So we can sort of see a little bit more detail. And I have a few tools inside of my Emacs config that will help us visualize what's going on here. So as you can see, there are three things in the flake: description, inputs, and outputs. Within each of these, kind of like YAML or JSON, we can create a hierarchical structure. So inputs will have a bunch of things, and each of those things may have options or parts of them. And so the first thing we're going to add like this is to the inputs block. One necessary component of the inputs block is going to be Nix packages. Nix packages is the package repo for NixOS. And so we have to declare where to find that input inside of the flake. The way we do this is through something like this. We write in Nix packages into the squiggly brackets of inputs, and then that equals some more squiggly brackets. What we want to give then is the URL that Nix packages is at. And this URL by default is going to be GitHub and then NixOS/Nix packages/NixOS 23.05. That's the latest stable release of NixOS. So if I save this, we'll see on the side area here how this is sort of working is that we still have description, inputs, and outputs, but now inputs has these components. There is the Nix packages piece, and then the URL is a part of Nix packages. If you go and look at people's NixOS configs, you will oftentimes not see it written out like this because there is a shorthand for writing this exact information. And that shorthand is going to look like this. Just nix packages.url equals, and then the aforementioned GitHub repo. And that is functionally identical to this setup we have here, where it's actually showing the whole hierarchy using the squiggly brackets. A few things of note to say about this actual URL is that, again, this is a Git repo, so you can actually go to GitHub and visit this repo, which we're going to do right now. So Nix packages, if you search for it, here it is. And so essentially what's going on here inside of this is we're saying go to GitHub, find the NixOS user or group, find the Nix packages repository, and then look for the NixOS-23.05 branch. You can change this to whatever branch you want, and there are a lot of branches to choose from. I recommend you stay with either the latest stable, which is NixOS-23.05, or you go to unstable, which is NixOS-unstable, which in a config would look something like this. Since NixOS is built around Nix packages, we can actually shorten this even further and remove the whole GitHub and NixOS part here and just say Nix packages / NixOS unstable or NixOS-23.05. And that is because NixOS knows where Nix packages is. But when you are specifying other inputs that are not special, like Nix packages, you do have to write out the whole thing, like GitHub, NixOS, Nix packages, and then the branch. So with this, that will do it for the inputs block. Now we have to mess with the outputs block. So again, as we're thinking about this here, the outputs block should be the NixOS configuration itself, the actual system. So we're going to add that as a part of the outputs block. And it is literally called NixOS configurations. Now we have to write some stuff for that as well. As you'll notice here, this says NixOS configurations, not NixOS configuration. So we can actually specify multiple configurations here, but we're only going to specify one to start out, and that will be the actual configuration for the current system. To start this, you give it a name, and usually people use their host name for this, but you can give it whatever name you want, and this is going to be equal to lib.nixossystem, and then we have to put a few more squiggly brackets because this is actually a function that makes a NixOS system. We have to pass a few arguments into the function to tell it what to actually build. The two arguments we're worried about here are system, which tells the architecture type. So odds are it's going to be x86-64-Linux. And then the other thing we have to pass into it is modules. This is a list of module Nix files. And what module Nix file do we have so far? Well, the only one we have right now is the configuration.nix. That is a Nix module. As I save it here, we'll see more on this outline on the right side here. Again, we have the outputs block, and then part of the outputs is the NixOS configurations, and then we have the NixOS tutorial. This is the name of my configuration that I have for this VM, and that has a system part to it and a modules part to it. So all of this is really just a hierarchical sort of structure. Again, kind of like YAML or JSON. Many people have commonly joked that NixOS is just YAML with functions. If you're an astute observer, you will notice that there is actually an error here, and the error is coming around lib. And the error that's happening is it does not know what lib actually is. Lib, or library, is a part of Nix packages. And essentially, lib just contains a bunch of really nice convenience functions that we can use, like NixOS system, which has the instructions on how to build a NixOS system using a architecture and a bunch of Nix modules. So we have to now add lib into the outputs in some fashion. And this is going to look really weird in a sense. So we're just going to go right into it. In order to pass lib from Nix packages into this outputs block, we're going to have to do something like this. So outputs is now going to be equal to some squiggly brackets in front here. And we put a bunch of stuff in these squiggly brackets, including Nix packages, followed by a colon. And then we need to use something called a let binding. So we're going to say let lib equal nixpackages.lib inside of this block for NixOS configurations. So the outputs block is still just this. It's this still just this NixOS configurations, but we're now passing in the lib from nixpackages.lib from the inputs into this actual definition. This essentially is a feature of functional programming languages, and Nix is a functional programming language, that you have to use lots of let bindings in order to pass certain things into other parts of the configuration. Now, I know that's not a very complete explanation of what's going on here, but that's sort of what we have to do to get started at least. So with this, assuming I didn't miss any semicolons, we should be able to go back to the VM and get this flake up and running. So we're back inside of the VM now, and we now have our flake.nix written and ready to go. And to synchronize the system state with this new flake setup, we're just going to use a slightly modified version of the rebuild command, which is sudo nixos rebuild switch -- flake, and then we're going to pass in this actual directory that we're in, the .files directory, so that it knows to go to this directory and this flake to build the system. And we're going to realize that I totally missed a semicolon somewhere. So if we go in and fix that, let's see here. There it is. Now we can try it again. And assuming that you didn't miss any semicolons when you're running this, it will start doing something like this. It's going to evaluate the derivation. It's going to create a lock file. That's the flake.lock file we were talking about before. And it's going to now have your system setup be using a flake. Do keep in mind also that this update may take a little while, as it is now going to be pulling the most recent version of that channel, whether it's 23.05 stable or unstable. It's going to be getting the most recent stuff, as now it is a flake. It's going to prefer the recent stuff, and so you may have to wait a little while for it to update. So hopefully then your rebuild command returns something successful like this. A common error that will prevent you from switching into the new system configuration using the flake is if your host name on your computer is different from the NixOS configurations name in your flake.nix. So if you go to the flake.nix, the name of my NixOS configuration is NixOS-tutorial, and the host name of my system is also NixOS-tutorial. So when I ran sudo nixos rebuild switch, I only needed to specify the directory, the current directory, in order to get this to work. But if these are different, you can specify the name of that configuration in the flake.nix by putting # and then name of configuration in the command. And this will select a configuration from the flake.nix that may be different from your host name. One last thing before we end the video today is let's take a look at the fancy flake.lock file that was automatically created for us when we switched using the flake.nix. So if you look at this file, you're going to see a lot of stuff here, and don't worry about all the stuff that's going on here, because you never have to manually interact with this. The purpose of the flake.lock file is to automatically manage the versions of your inputs and your packages for you. And this is just sort of what it looks like. Every time you update the system, you're going to be updating the flake.lock file. And because the flake references the flake.lock file, when you synchronize the system state with that flake.lock, it will be essentially updating the packages. How do you update the flake.lock then? It's real simple. You run the command nix flake update while inside of your .files directory, and this will go and check all of the inputs and update them to the most recent version, like this. Do keep in mind that running nix flake update does not update the system. It only updates the flake.lock file. So if we wanted to actually update the system, it would involve running both nix flake update and then sudo NixOS rebuild switch -- flake and then specifying the directory that we're in for that flake. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about NixOS. I hope this guide was helpful to you on your NixOS journey. We're going to be continuing the tutorial going forward, and next time we're going to be probably exploring Home Manager and a few other cool Nix things. So if you like this video, please leave a like, comment on the video. Please subscribe if you really like the content that I'm providing here. If you dislike the video, please leave a dislike and let me know why you disliked it in the comment section down below. And as always, have a great rest of your day.